Good day and welcome to the Principia webinar series. This week we have got our first webinar, and the topic this week is psychometrics. This is a recorded webinar, but in future we will be doing live webinars. And in this webinar series we hope to explore various topics within credit and collections. And we will be delving into various topics, and we'd also invite you to send in your questions or your recommendations in terms of what webinars you'd like to see as well. So this week we are talking about psychometrics. It's a big topic right now. There's a big focus internationally and also in South Africa in alternative data and bringing alternative scoring within the credit granting space. So I'm joined this week with Dr. Jürgen Becker. He's the CEO of Astra Constantine. It's a company that Principia has teamed up with. We have a partnership, and we will be offering psychometrics in the South African credit market. So welcome, Jürgen. If you'd like to give an introduction, please.
Yeah. So thanks, Tom, for the introduction. So we are really excited to work with psychometrics. We have been for a number of years, maybe for probably the best part of the last 8-9 years around psychometrics. And I'm, like Tom said, I work for, I'm the CEO of Astra Constantine, who's traditionally been developing psychometrics tools and consulting services around the traditional uses of psychometrics. But in the last 8 years or so, we've kind of branched into the credit space, and it's an exciting area to be in, and so I'd love to explore some of these themes in this webinar.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we thought it was a great partnership. Principia being in credit for over 20 years, bringing in an industrial psychologist organization that can then bring in this added benefit of alternative data. So let's explore that a little bit further. The first thing I just want to introduce is just set the scene a little bit in terms of the South African market, and you're seeing similar trends in other countries as well. In South Africa, we estimate that there's about 18 million credit unaware customers. Yes, some of these customers would be perhaps unemployed, but many of the customers there we believe could be potentially credit worthy. Now, traditionally, lenders have struggled a lot to grant credit with these customers because there's very little data to use. They use demographic scorecards that have low discrimination ability, and they set very risk-averse credit strategies. So you actually end up declining a lot of applicants who are credit unaware, and it becomes a bit like a vicious circle. If you can't get credit, you can't get credit unless if you've already got credit, and you can't already have had credit if you haven't been granted credit. So it feeds on itself. So we believe that psychometrics allows us to create a wide range of additional data, and that data has been shown to be quite predictive of future credit risk. And that is a wonderful thing, because you don't need a credit record in order to have psychometrics. You can do psychometrics and get data and then produce a score and then set your cutoffs just as you would a normal credit score. So before we get into more about psychometrics and credit, I just wanted to ask Jürgen if you could perhaps explain a little bit around what, in fact, are psychometrics and where are they used outside of credit?
Yeah, so I mean, in the most basic way, psychometrics deals with the measurement of psychological constructs. So, the metric part and then the psych part, which makes up the concept, is really defining what we do. So we're really trying to develop techniques and methods to measure a lot of the time abstract abilities, traits, values, interests, all the kind of constructs that you would deal with in a sort of an employment situation. And psychometrics' goal over the last 200 years or what have been to really refine our measurements of these psychological constructs, and it's really used in a very wide variety of different applications. I mean, we'll speak to some of them now, but they've shown to be very predictive instability in behavior. These traits underlie your behavior. So if there's stability in the traits and the traits inform the behavior, then the assumption is that there will be consistency in behavior, and that gives it some kind of predictive power, and that's why it's important in this conversation.
Okay. And so where exactly have psychometrics been used? I think most of us will be familiar with the employment application, and then you have to set your psychometrics to determine whether you're a good fit for that company and indeed the team itself. But have they been used elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think in a typical life cycle, depending where you're from, I mean, probably one of your first interactions with psychometrics would be when you do vocational testing, or when you're in high school. Potentially you want to know what career you need to go into, and so that's probably the first interaction where you deal with psychometrics formally, and then perhaps if you're from the United States, you will have to do GREs and SATs, which is the test that you do to get admission into universities, for example. And certainly later on when you apply for your first job. In South Africa, we've got a very, very strong history in using psychometric tests for employment situations, mainly because we have very rigorous labor laws around employment, but certainly around the world, it's become a stable for selection purposes. So you'll see that most of your large organizations use it there. If I had to say something about application, I would still say 80% is in the employment recruitment area, but we're seeing a huge amount of application in other behind the scenes metrics, anything from web browsers right through to online dating. So I think the application has widened significantly beyond just the normal recruitment and selection space.
Okay. And so, and psychometrics in credit, it's not new, is it?
Not really. I mean, Tom, you would be able to speak to this because I believe you're personally involved with it. But I mean, most of us came to hear of it in terms of venture cap, and the first time I came across it was a conference about 10 or 12 years ago where the idea was how do we create new data points in areas where there's no data, specifically in the area of recruiting the best entrepreneurs. So what kind of entrepreneurial profile do you need to be successful? And that quickly migrated to, right, if you have the right entrepreneur, is there a correspondence between their psychometric makeup and how they handle credit? Because I mean, the idea of entrepreneurship and venture cap goes hand in hand. And so remarkably what's been found is you've got a certain profile of an entrepreneur that shows certain traits in their business practices, and they show very much the same traits in how they handle credit. And then we started seeing guys like the Harvard EFLs starting dabbling with it, and they really made it mainstream because of that connection with Harvard University. But certainly from then on, being a very, very niche market, I think it's become pretty mainstream. And I read a report that from the World Bank that it's estimated that it's used in quite an extensive number of countries. I recall something like 50 or 60 countries are using it pretty extensively. So I would say it's still a small minority when it comes to credit scoring, but it's certainly gaining traction very quickly.
Okay. And so, yeah, I mean, you talked about entrepreneurship, so presumably it can be used for assessing creditworthiness of for an SME application, but obviously consumers as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we believe that the stability that you get from these sort of behavioral patterns and the way that people, so there's a basic premise that people like to act congruently. So you would want your behavior to be fairly consistent from one day to the next. And of course, we don't all act in congruence one day to the next, but there is a stability in our traits and how we conduct ourselves, how we approach problems at life, how do we approach relationships, and the same could be said for finances. And sort of that's been an area where nobody really dabbled with because it's very private. But I think the idea is that we could learn very much more about our consumers through this kind of data. And I think that the fear has always been around exploitation around it, because it is really personal information. But it's also in this era where we talk about scalable personalization, right? So you want to know your customer, you want to know whether you're a bank or a retail market. You want to understand your customer at scale, but have a specific tailored product or service for them. And really, this, to my mind, is one of the best ways to do that, to understand your customer better. Yeah, with assuming that the data has been collected in an ethical and fair way.
So, those are familiar with writing a psychometric for employment would be familiar that you're often forced to put yourself through 200 questions or so. It can take quite a substantial amount of time. For a credit application, you're not going to be putting the customer through an hour and a half assessment. So just some discussion points around the psychometrics from 10 years ago. They tried to use very similar questions that were used in a traditional psychometric test within for employment. Those questions were very wordy, quite long. They then shortened the number of questions. It didn't always work as well as they hoped, and there's a couple of use cases which didn't do well at all. And one of the problems was that they were very wordy, and you're dealing with countries where perhaps English isn't a first language, or English isn't a second language even, or a language that people are comfortable answering in. So a very wordy test, quite problematic, and a very long test, also quite problematic. So so those two things meant that we sort of evolved over that time, and now we've got something called the situation judgmental test. Can you explain a little bit about what that's all about?
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, I think when psychometric tests were developed back in the day, user interface and enjoyment was not number one and number two on the priority list. So they tended to be, previously back in the day, they used to be literally paper and pencil. So you would get a standardized form. They would be protected in some way. People would have restricted access to them to protect the IP. And once the IP leaked, of course, they could be gamed quite easily and faked. And faking still is and was pretty rife with traditional tests. There is indeed some guardrails around it to try and prevent against that. So certainly, I'm not dismissing the value of traditional psychometric tests. They've served us very well, but the new era in which we are, and also the new generational cohorts that's starting to go to work and start to apply for credit and engage with bank services, has predominantly done that in a virtual environment. And I think many of the customers that you will deal with, if they're like me, I haven't set foot in a bank or applied for something in a bank in a very long time, or even for anybody, pretty much everything is virtual. So the situational judgment tests emerged from this kind of idea that we wanted to make a more user-friendly user interface. So something that people can easier relate to, and very, very important to ask and frame our questions in context-specific ways. So we wanted to have contextual cues in there, because when we ask a question without context, or just on a plain paper and pencil, there's a lack of fidelity between the actual scenario that the person need to imagine that they are in, or put themselves in psychologically, and the test format. And so the idea around situational judgment test is really to create context around it, and it's only become possible in the last couple of years with increase of personal phones. So smartphones previously could not handle and render the kind of graphics. And so with the technology increasing on the one hand, the other hand, scientists understanding more about user experience and how user experience have an impact on scores, situational judgment tests were born. And the major big advantage is the enjoyable user interface, the fidelity with the real world. And the third thing that's really, really important is providing context around these questions and stimuli. And that proved to be a big part of the equation.
Okay. So I thought we might just jump in. I think you've described it very well, but I think for many people who are visual, they might appreciate us just showing them an example of the test, and then perhaps you can just talk through it. So let me just get my screen up and share it.
Yeah, so this is a typical example of a specific question that's in our assessment. And many of you who had seen similar applications would know that, you know, other vendors might use stock images or, you know, just images they get from the internet. And through doing a lot of cross-cultural work in my own career, you know, as an academic as well, the reality was that we faced there is cultural problems in interpretation of some of these tests. I mean, they are interpreted through the lens of your own culture, and that includes language. And we know that in the bottom part of the market, we know that the schooling levels, especially English literature, might be quite low. And even in some countries, it might not even be, you know, a language that's often conversed in. And so from the onset, what we set out to do is the test needs to be easy to do. It needs to be mobile friendly. In other words, the response options need to be very simple to understand, even if you don't understand the instructions concretely. And you need to be able to do that 7 minutes on a mobile phone, and it needs to be scalable. So this specific solution, each of these 9 scenarios or these 9 vignettes is tapping into some kind of psychological construct or in some competency. And the idea is that the person needs to make a choice, and it's a simple drag and drop kind of action that's used. And once they've made their selection, there's also a slider to indicate the degree of agreement that they have with those 2 options. And the idea really is to provide the user with a balanced amount of positive and negative questions. And what I mean by positive and negative questions is questions that's quite easy to answer and that doesn't evoke any ego defense, and equal amount of difficult ones. And the idea is that the person is forced to make a choice because that reveals something about the person's preferences. Second, what's important is now for the first time we can measure on-screen behavior. Now, many of these other applications are very static. So what we have found that the on-screen behavior, in other words, how long do you, for example, take to make a choice, for example, can indicate quite a lot about the person's personal makeup, the innate abilities. So the combination of doing this on screen and harvesting or measuring some other metrics that's behind the scene has proven to be a powerful combination. And so it looks fairly simple, but there's a lot of intricate measurements that goes on the back end and algorithms. The second thing probably worth mentioning is you'll see the characters has been developed to be really as far as possible race-free. So I mean, it's difficult to see if of those characters, if what racial group they're from or ethnic group they're from. And although there's undertones of gender, that's also been toned down to a large extent. So the idea is really, we want people to just be relaxed. We want them to not have any preconceived biases based on the actors that's in each of these characters, and that they can resonate with them. And to a large extent, that's what we try to do with the user interface.
Okay, so just to summarize, then you have 10 questions, and each of the 10 questions puts the applicant in a certain position. So in this case, it says money is. What does it mean to you? And you choose the first item that most resonates with you, and the second item that secondly resonates with you.
Yep.
And then you also choose the amount that you agree, how strongly you agree with your choice. So if you absolutely think that money is all about saving, perhaps, or budgeting, then you choose the bottom right one, and you put it up and you select 10 out of 10.
Yep.
And then your second one might be buying a nice car. That would be second choice, but maybe you feel 5 out of 10. So that's how you do it. And you'd be, and all the while you're doing this, you're generating data. So you're generating what did you choose? How quickly did you choose it? Were you indecisive at all? And the test, I believe, creates about 75 different data points. So it's quite an extensive number. It's 7.5 data points a question. It's quite an extensive number, and all in all, those data points are used within creating a score. So a score is created, and just as we use credit scores, you would use a psychometric score with a cutoff, and above the cutoff you grant credit, and below the cutoff you don't. If it's being used for credit granting. So that's really an explanation of the test from a credit perspective. And you've said, you try to create the cultures, race groups, genders, even age groups, I notice as well, fairly neutral. So, I mean, do you have a feeling at all of how well you did it? I mean, there is a question to say, listen, would everybody be able to resonate with golf? Is that something there? Everyone can resonate with money, but some things maybe mean slightly different things to different people. So, I mean, the important thing is we're seeing results, right? So regardless of how it resonates with different people differently, the test is yielding results, i.e. it's predictive of risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a fair point. And look, the design intention has always been to make this application in your credit application process as frictionless as possible. So surely there is a place to make this longer, more comprehensive, perhaps even better images and so on, different cultural nuanced applications for it. But I think the real, as the Americans say, the secret sauce in this whole application is really how the data works together, and the combination of on-screen and behind the scenes kind of metrics that we measure, and really all of that is baked together in a final score. And so one might look at it and say, look, I don't think this is going to work in this culture or that culture. The reality is that the score doesn't stand or fall on that one specific vignette. But the reality is, as we're doing ongoing research, we can rank order all these vignettes and say which ones are the most predictive of risk and which ones is the least predictive. And then when we combine that into an algorithm, we really see the kind of differentiation which we hoped. But it is a tough trade-off to do a test that's catering for most people, given our educational differences in South Africa, and especially in the rest of Africa, where we found some application for this versus having powerful prediction. And I think we're trying to get to that optimal point with it.
Yeah, so one thing that's noticeable for me is that in credit poor or credit data poor countries, i.e. Countries with perhaps less sophisticated credit bureaus, it's in those countries that we see quite a lot of innovation and quite a lot of adoption of these sort of innovative solutions. We've seen it over the last 10 years with organizations taking advantage of social media data, typically in countries which don't have rich bureau data. So your experience with adoption of your test, and I suppose if you look at the market and see where these tests are being adopted, I know it's a lot of countries, but a lot of data poor countries.
Yeah, absolutely, and strong, very, very strong movement in Southeast Asia, for example, and strong movement in East Africa. And I think it's just a copybook example of how technology will leapfrog applications. We see that in healthcare, we see that in telecoms, where if there's not brick and mortar infrastructure, technology kind of leapfrogs over that and renders a service. And I think psychometric scoring, credit to a large extent, I would argue the biggest proportion of Africa is probably outside of sophisticated credit infrastructure like we have in South Africa. And the reality of the situation is, how do we cater for that? And if we just look at what most Africans have, and the same goes in Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia, is to have a mobile phone. And that's the primary tool to their disposal for conversing, socializing, driving their business. And so that's created an incredible launchpad to get information about credit on people. And I think it will, the fact that, strong guys, traditional credit scoring bureaus and stuff is starting to incorporate this is for me a sign that there's something there. And it's not only just really about prediction, it's also about ease of access. So sure, we can spend a lot of time on getting very powerful information about people, but what is the delivery method, what is the scale, and what's the cost of that? And I think the kind of psychometrics applications we talk to here ticks most of those boxes in terms of cost, scale, and reach. And that's really important because there's a big drive for credit, huge appetite for it. And I think these applications are servicing those specific markets that need it. And so, yeah, big uptake, exponential in those specific industries, and not just from our application, but from big-time global players as well that's starting to get into alternative scoring.
Okay, yeah, and then I just wanted to jump in on now on the very important question of how well is it predicting risk. So yeah, just want to jump onto that. You said you've reported a Gini of around in the 30s. So you're running this test in a few countries now. Yeah, just to say as well, a few countries with different cultures as well, and it's working well in all those countries. So Gini in the mid-30s. So just to give you some context, yes, bureau scores, we expect Ginis to be in sophisticated countries in the 40s and the 50s perhaps. Where there is no bureau data or bureau-rich data, then we often are relying on application scores using demographic information. And there, those Ginis stay quite a lot lower than the bureau scores. They're in the low mid-20s frequently. And so as a result, we see that there's quite a lot of additional lift potentially that could be done with the psychometric score. And then the other thing to say is it's you could use the two scores together. So there's a potential for incremental lift on top of your demographic score as well. And I think more about that a little later. So I think in terms of the ultimate question of does it work? Does it predict risk? We are seeing that. So I think that we've got a lot of confidence that the tool will work in your business as well. So I want to touch a little bit now on which sort of segments of the market we might be able to use it. So we've talked about small businesses, perhaps those proprietors. It's all about sustainability of a business and the important traits to have when you're running a business. And a bad debt within a small business is often related to the sustainability of the company as well. That's important. So that comes into play. The consumer, so consumer loans. There's a question of how well it works with very large loans versus smaller loans. We're seeing, and then credit unaware, obviously in South African market, very important. But then also the margin calls. What about those customers that have a bureau record? They're coming in sort of just around the cutoff. We're not sure whether, we would love a little bit more discrimination just to determine whether we should accept this person or not. Bring in the psychometric score, assess them, and then make the ultimate decision based on that for the margin calls. And then you could get very creative. Once the score is in place, you could potentially use it for existing customer marketing, but potentially there's some traits there that could look at whether somebody takes up an offer from you. You could look at it in the collection space and how to manage your customers based on their psychometric traits. That could also be something that we'd explore. We haven't yet. And moreover, you could then get your agents to take these psychometrics as well. And we've talked a lot about in the industry around agent matching between agent and customer. If you've got the psychometrics of both, there's potentially an opportunity there. So I think there's a lot to brainstorm, a lot of things to explore. And I think a lot of exciting areas where we could see psychometrics playing a large role. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's just talk a little bit about exploring the practicalities of deploying the test itself. You talked about smartphones, etc. What does it take? If you're an organization, you're lending right now, and you say, sure, it would be great. Credit unaware, I really want to have a solution for them, and I think Psychometrics is the one for me. Is it possible? How easy is it going to be to deploy Psychometrics in my origination process?
Well, Tom, I think it's very simple. Like I said, we developed a test, number one, to be as frictionless as possible, and where you're going to deploy that in your process, in your origination process, is going to be important. But it could be a simple API integration, into your existing application process. It could be really where there's a call made to our test, and it gets calculated, and there's some agreement on the data. So it's very simple to deploy it. What's very important to mention here is that all the various POPI regulations around data sharing and stuff is kept front of mind, because we're working with personal data, and more than that, we're also working with psychological data. So it needs to be embedded in the right ecosystem, obviously, to protect the integrity of the data and also of the person. I think all of us, it's very front of mind. So the integration process is very simple. Exactly where to deploy it, it will depend on the customer. A lot of customers might use that as a final hurdle. Maybe when you talk about those margin calls in the process, another customer might have it right up front, to look at credit unaware where there's nothing, and that might be it, in combination with maybe some basic bioform or something like that. So it really depends on where the customer wants to deploy it, but it's no different than filling out, for example, a credit application. Person is already there. They know that they have to provide some information to get through the test. What I do like to mention here is that our feedback, qualitative feedback, is that clients typically enjoy to do it. They don't find it threatening. They don't find the questions to be unrelated, and not relevant, offensive even. So they get through it. It's pretty easy to go through a test, and the completion rates are very, very high. So you're going to sit with very few incomplete tests at a 5-minute median time for testing. And so it fits really into that customer that wants to come in, don't have a lot of time. You can't run 100 different checks on it. Maybe you have 2 or 3 different applications, and this either comes in the front end or on the back end, so it works either way. And the completion rate is around 97%. So you're going to have very, very few spoiled tests from a customer's perspective.
Okay, so let's just summarize there. So I'm sitting with a digital application process, a website. So a customer starts applying on a website or even an app. Basically, I get to a point and it says, please take the following psychometric test. They click on a link. It's an API. The system is hosted in the cloud. They click on a link, up pops the psychometric test. It's customized what fields might get filled in at that stage, and then they progress with the 10 questions. They click close, and then it goes back to their application process. So if they're in store, then they could do it on a tablet. If they're doing it on their phone, they do it on their phone. It's a very invasive, uninvasive test. And so that's a pretty straightforward process end to end. And then obviously the score then gets fed back into the loan origination system, and then cutoffs get put in place, and all that, just as you would with a demographic scorecard. So that's great. Then just a very interesting point, I sort of alluded to it a little bit earlier, but how stable are the tests, in the sense, if I do a test now and then I do a test in a year's time, will I get the same score, or is it going to be vastly different?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Tom. And most of the psychometric theory has demonstrated that your innate abilities, let's talk about personality values and so on, are fairly stable from anything from 12 to 16 years upwards. So most of the applicants that would do this test, we would assume that they have a fairly stable set of traits, as we call them. And so there's always some degree of variation, but very little. I mean, these tests are developed to be very reliable, and we talk about temporal stability. Over time, they need to be very stable, which they prove to be. And there is a component that measures emotions or emotiveness, and surely that can flux, and that can vary from scenario to scenario or from life stage to life stage. But even so, the bulk majority of the test is fairly stable. So once a client has done that, potentially it could be valid for up to 5 years, assuming that no huge life event or trauma has happened in the interim. So it's a pretty stable score. And our research suggests that the scores are very stable.
So I mean, it is very interesting, because if you compare it to, say, for example, a bureau score, I mean, that changes almost daily. That changes. You need to understand what the person's bureau score was at the time of application. You do a retro with the bureau, get the score, and then you work out performance. I mean, essentially here, you could take a psychometric today and say, well, if we had done this test 6 months ago, we would have got the same score. Would we have made that decision or not? So from a modeler's perspective, it means that I can derive quite a lot of conclusions out of the test. So I could get a whole random sample of people to do the test today and look at seeing how they're conducting their credit affairs at the same time, and understand whether there's a good relationship there. So without having to wait 6 months or 12 months or whatever. So that, I think, so long as the person hasn't had a stroke or some severe life event, as you say, it's going to be fairly stable. So it is very interesting in that regard. And as I said before, you get it done at originations. You could use it later on for existing customer marketing or even collections in the same vein later on. Okay. All right, so I think we run out of time now. There's a lot of more questions I'd love to have asked, but I think we'll wrap it up now. Maybe we'll have another chance to chat about some more at a later stage. But I'd just like to thank you so much for joining me today on our first webinar. And thanks for exploring psychometrics with me. I'm very excited by it personally, and I think there's big opportunity in the South African market for more lenders to look to adopting psychometrics, not just in the credit unaware space, but also some of the credit aware, and not just in originations, elsewhere as well. So I look forward to seeing how the market starts to adopt psychometrics more and more, and how we see the model going from strength to strength. So thanks so much, Jürgen, and until next time, goodbye.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thanks for having me.